Just getting ready to bottle this 2019 Zinfandel Merlot Rosé in this carboy right here, and I thought this would be a good opportunity to talk about degassing. If you like these kinds of winemaking videos, be sure to swing by my website, smartwinemaking.com, and click the little subscribe button below. The wine that we're working with today is this Zinfandel Merlot, which was basically a Saunier. So I was making a red wine, and in order to give a little bit of a better skin to juice ratio, I'll pump off a little bit of juice early on in that process, which gives me a rosé as well. And both of those grapes are very, very friendly rosé grapes. And I gotta say, this wine is excellent. I'm very, very pleased with how it turned out. But it does have a tiny, tiny bit of residual CO2 in it. So in this case, we're gonna go ahead and give it a little tiny degas. But let's talk about, when should you degas? Should you degas? And how can you do it? Being that this is a rosé, I'm gonna degas it, but at the same time, it's really subjective. I don't mind leaving a little bit of CO2, and I mean a little tiny, tiny bit, in a white wine or a rosé that's intended to be served chilled. So if you leave a little bit, so if I were to swirl this up a little bit at room temperature and see just some tiny bubbles around the rim, if I chill that, the CO2 is going to be a lot less likely to come back out of suspension. It's a lot more soluble at low temperatures. So what you'll find is you put a wine in bottle close to room temperature. This is 67 degrees down here, and you chill it, you're pretty unlikely to see those little CO2 bubbles. But on the flip side, if you put a wine into a bottle in the winter time, if it's say 55 degrees in your cellar and it warms up to 70 degrees in the summer, that little bit of dissolved CO2 is probably going to start to come out of that wine, and you're going to see this little, right around the rim of the glass when you pour it, just a tiny bit of CO2. And it's not going to feel like the wine's carbonated, but it's just going to be a bad presentation. And it can kind of change the character of that wine. A wine with a little bit of CO2 can kind of cover up the tannin and taste a little weak, I would say, versus if you were to really degas that wine out, it's going to really come to life and be a little bit more lively for you. So some general rules about when do you probably want to consider degassing and when is it not a big deal. If the wine is aged in a barrel, it's probably not going to need degassed. The barrels are relatively porous. As that wine kind of seeps through the pores and tries to evaporate, it'll create a small vacuum inside the headspace of that barrel. You have to keep kind of topping them up, and they'll naturally degas, really no problem. If the wine is over probably a year in carboy, maybe year and a half, again, probably not going to have to worry about degassing. There's going to be very, very little CO2 in that wine. If you're bottling less than a year, then it's time maybe to consider it. If you're bottling and it's cold, like I said, CO2 is a lot more soluble in colder liquids. Same goes for oxygen, actually. So you're just going to be a little bit more likely to have that CO2 kind of come back out when you bring that back to room temperature. I'd say that pretty much covers that. Some things you can do, there are some tools on the market to try to test how much CO2 is in your wine, but they're really, really expensive for what they are. There's one that's called a carbodossier, which is basically a graduated cylinder or a mixing cylinder with a straw in it that you shake it up and squirt the wine out of the top. And depending on how much the volume changes, you can have an idea of how much CO2 is in the wine. I tried to put something together here that you guys could do at home, which is basically just a a soda bottle, the smallest one I could find. If you can find smaller, that would be even better. And if you fill this to a known height, and I'm just going to do a quick demo, but quite frankly, I don't care what the number is right now. But if you were to fill this to, say, I don't know, the bottom of this label each time, you can start to get a, I don't know, a better way to quantify how much CO2 is in your wine and how it might compare to some other wines that you have. But on the lid of this, I put a Schrader valve, which is like a tire valve. I've got some threaded ones off of Amazon that I'll put in the description of this video. And then I've just got a tire pressure gauge. So if you take this and just shake the heck out of it, you're going to see it's going to pressurize a little bit, and then you'll get a small pressure reading. And there's just not enough CO2 in this tiny bit of wine that I put in to get this gauge to read. But like for a reference, Coca-Cola, I was getting about 15 psi if I fill up to the line. So you can build one of those if you want. It's nice to build some fun little tools sometimes, but to tell you the truth, I'll probably never really use it. You can kind of taste if the wine has a little bit of CO2 in it. But let's talk about how to degas the wine. And I'm going to give you 3 ways. The way that it's done often in big wineries when you're dealing with huge tanks is they're just going to bubble inert gas through that wine. So you can bubble helium through it, you can bubble argon through it, you can bubble nitrogen through it, and just try to let those CO2 bubbles grab onto those other bubbles that are already in there, and sort of just gives them an inoculation point, or I don't know what the word for it is, but a point for those bubbles to grab and shoot out of the wine. And in the home, I don't know, I don't necessarily want to waste my argon on degassing, but if I was gonna, I'd use basically a little carbonation stone and bubble it through. The other thing you can do in the home, this is a brake bleeder it's a vacuum brake bleeder that I've just put a little wine bung on, and you can just create a vacuum in that carboy. To do this, you need a little bit of head space. So the times I've done this, like this 3-gallon carboy, I'd probably take a half gallon out of it so that I can still swirl that wine up really good. It's going to foam up as it's trying to pull those bubbles out. So that's a pretty good way to degas. But the ultimate way, this is one of the little wine making tools that I built, and this is this all stainless degasser tool, which is basically a 3/8 inch 304 stainless rod with some stainless steel chain welded to the side. So any of these other store-bought degassing tools you're going to be hard-pressed to find one that doesn't have plastic paddles on it or something. But this tool is going to outlive you. It's going to outlive your kids. It's a pretty sweet tool. So I offer this for sale on my website, again, smartwinemaking.com. So swing by there if you want to buy one of these. I'm trying to offer them at a super good price so that you can have them, but enough that I can afford to make these things. But basically, you mount it to your cordless drill, and as you rack this, you can slide it through the neck of a carboy. It fits fine. You'd want to, again, have a little bit of head space so you don't foam out. Or what I'm going to do today is I'm going to rack this wine into a bucket. So we'll go ahead and we'll do that, give it a little degas, and I'm going to bottle half of it, and I'm going to put half of it in one of those little 2.5 gallon torpedo kegs so that we can serve it on draft. So let's go ahead and give that a try. As we're getting this wine racked out of the carboy, off just the little bit of fine lees here and into a bucket, I'm just going to mention a couple things. You don't want to do any sort of degassing when you are on these fine lees, because I'm not about to want to bring these back up into suspension after this wine has got crystal clear. If you have the option to degas at a little bit of a warmer temperature, like 70 to 75 degrees Fahrenheit, it's going to be a little bit better. It's going to be a little bit less likely to absorb any or as much oxygen in the process. And also it's going to help that CO2 kind of get out of the wine because it doesn't really want to be dissolved at those temperatures. I did just do a free SO2 test. I did the Ripper method with the little Vinimetrica tester. I always do that before I bottle a wine. And this wine's sitting at about 40 parts per million. Ideally, you really want to be in the 20 to 25 parts per million at the pH that I'm at. I'm at about 3.22, but being a rosé, there's almost no tannin. I could happily nudge that number up a little bit, like 35 to 40 parts per million. But we're going to drink this wine probably within a year, so I'm not too worried. But where I'm going with that is, at 40 parts per million now, just in the process of bottling, we're going to lose probably 5 to 10 parts per million because it's a relatively oxidative process. Throw degassing into the mix and you can probably turn that into a loss of about 10 to 15 parts per million. So my 40 parts per million, by the time I'm done degassing, done bottling, and give it a little time to kind of come back to equilibrium, we're probably going to find that we're at about 25 parts per million. And I'm going to say that's probably going to be fine. If I had a little residual sugar, I'd probably push again up towards like that 40 parts per million. If we had to add any SO2, we'd do it now. So we'll show you how easy it is to degas with this little tool here. So if you had a kit wine or something too, where you're really trying to stir up the ingredients, this will work really good too. Look at all the CO2 coming off that wine. You can hear it. We're just going to give it one more little go. I'm not going to get too carried away because it is a rosé that'll be served cold. Like I said, if this was a red wine, I'd probably spend, I don't know, a good 5 or so minutes here just kind of working the CO2 out until you just don't see much more coming out of it. This is a 6-gallon bucket, 5 gallons of wine in it. If you're going to do 6 gallons of wine, you're going to want to use one of those 7-gallon fermenting buckets. All right, maybe one more. So there we go, we've knocked the CO2 back in just a few minutes time, and I'm pretty sure it's probably less than half of what it was. I didn't get too carried away to completely degas the wine because it is, after all, a rosé. Some people intentionally want a little CO2 in their rosés, but something I just wanted to do anyways, show you guys how to do it. And if this was a red wine, I would not want any CO2 in that wine. I just think a little CO2 on a red wine can sort of kind of take the edge off of it, and I like a little bit of a more edgy red wine. Hope this was helpful for you. If you got any questions or feedback on my new little stainless steel tool, be sure to mention it in the comments, and keep your eye out on my website because I'll offer these for sale. Thanks for watching.